Hello and welcome. There are moments in history when the very fabric of reality tears apart, when a door opens that should have remained forever sealed. The Orcgate Wars represent such a moment, a catastrophe born not from natural disaster or divine whim, but from mortal ambition and the hubris of those who believed they could control powers beyond their understanding. What began as an act of rebellion against an empire became an invasion that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, topple gods themselves, and forever alter the balance of power in Eastern Faerun. This is the story of a portal to another world, of gray-skinned warriors who poured through in numbers beyond counting, and of the desperate struggle to close a gateway that threatened to drown civilization beneath a tide of savage conquest. You need to understand the world as it existed before the portal opened, before everything changed. Travel back with me to the late -1100s Dale reckoning, to the eastern shores of the Alamber Sea, where two ancient empires dominated the landscape. Mulhorand and Unther were not merely kingdoms, but theocracies ruled by living gods, or more precisely, by divine manifestations who walked among mortals and shaped their civilizations directly. These were the descendants of slaves who had escaped the ancient empire of Amaskar, guided by their deities to freedom and given the power to build new nations. Mulhorand was an empire of rigid order and ancient tradition, where the God Kings reigned from golden thrones, and the populace worshipped them not merely as distant powers, but as present rulers who could be seen and petitioned. The Mulhorandi pantheon included powerful deities like Io himself, though he rarely manifested directly, and his servants who governed in his name. Chief among the active God Kings was Ray, the sun deity whose manifestation led the empire with wisdom accumulated over millennia. The Mulhorandi built great cities of stone and bronze, raised monuments that would endure for ages, and maintained a civilization that had persisted essentially unchanged for over 1,000 years. Unther, Mulhorand's neighbor and sometimes rival, followed a similar pattern of divine rulership. The god king Gilgim ruled Unther with absolute authority, his word law, his will unquestionable. The relationship between Mulhorand and Unther oscillated between cooperation and conflict, brief wars interspersed with longer periods of tense peace. They had fought as recently as -1967 Dale reckoning, a conflict that ended only when their respective divine rulers agreed to establish the river Alamber as a permanent boundary between their realms. Between these two empires lay a region known as Delhumide, a province of Mulhorand that occupied the elevated plateau of Thayd. This territory had long been restive under Mulhorandi rule. Its people, resentful of taxes and restrictions imposed from the distant capital. The region was home to many powerful wizards, mages who chafed under the authority of priest kings and divine mandates. Magic in Mulhorand was supposed to serve the gods and their chosen representatives. But the wizards of Delhumide had other ideas about how power should be wielded and who should wield it. In negative 1087 Dale Reckoning, open rebellion erupted in Delhumide. The leader of this uprising was a figure known as Thayd, called the last apprentice of Amaskar, a title that suggested he possessed knowledge from the ancient empire that had enslaved Mulhorand's ancestors so long ago. Whether this claim was literal truth or propaganda designed to enhance his mystique, we cannot say with certainty. What we know is that Thayd was a wizard of immense power and ambition, a man who believed he could challenge the God Kings themselves and prevail. Thayd's rebellion began with surprising success. He conquered Delhumide with the support of the region's wizards and disaffected population, declaring independence from Mulhorand. His forces pushed south toward Mulhorand's heartland, and for a time, it seemed he might actually succeed in carving out an independent realm. But Mulhorand's resources were vast, and when the God Kings turned their full attention to crushing the rebellion, Thayd's momentum stalled and then reversed. Within a year, by negative 1081 Dale Reckoning, the rebellion had been defeated and Thayd captured. The execution of Thayd was meant to send a message to anyone else who might consider defying divine authority. As he faced his death, Thayd reportedly pronounced a curse, swearing that Mulhorand and Unther would never again know the greatness they had achieved. The priest kings dismissed this as the empty boast of a defeated rebel. They could not have known the terrible truth behind his words. What Mulhorand's rulers did not discover during Thayd's interrogation was that he had created something extraordinary and terrible during his brief period of control over Delhumide, using knowledge that may indeed have come from ancient Amaskar, combining it with his own magical research and the assistance of his fellow conspirators. Thayd had opened a portal, not a simple teleportation gate connecting 2 points on Faerun, but a bridge between worlds, a stable passage linking Toril to another realm entirely. The specific magic he used, the rituals and components required, these details died with him, but the portal remained, hidden somewhere on the plateau of Thayd, unknown to the victorious Mulhorandi who had crushed his rebellion. For 5 years, the portal sat dormant and undiscovered. Life in the region slowly returned to normal under renewed Mulhorandi administration. The surviving rebels were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The wizards who had supported Thayd either submitted to divine authority or fled to other lands. Delhumide was occupied by Mulhorandi troops, ensuring no new uprising could take root. The God Kings believed the threat had been eliminated, that order had been restored. They were wrong. On the other side of that hidden portal, in a realm whose nature remains debated by scholars to this day, lived the Gray Orcs. These were not the mountain orcs or common orcs familiar to most of Faerun, but a distinct people with their own culture and capabilities. Some historians suggest this was a primitive world where Orc civilization had developed in isolation. Others propose it was a pocket dimension, perhaps created by the Orc deity Gruumsh as a haven for his people. A few even theorize it might have been a distant region of Toril itself, separated by such vast distances that no contact had occurred before Thayd's portal bridged the gap. Whatever the truth of their origin, the Gray Orcs who discovered Thayd's portal in -1076 Dale Reckoning were numerous, organized, and hungry for conquest. This could suggest that their own world faced some crisis, that they needed new lands for expanding populations. Or perhaps they were simply a warrior culture that saw the portal as an opportunity for glory and plunder. They did not hesitate. They organized their forces, assembled weapons and supplies, and prepared for invasion. Then they marched through the gateway in numbers that would eventually reach hundreds of thousands, pouring onto the plateau of Thayd like a flood through a broken dam. The first Mulhorandi settlements to encounter this invasion had no warning, no preparation, no understanding of what they faced. Imagine being a farmer working fields that had been peaceful for generations, or a merchant traveling the trade roads that connected the plateau's communities. Suddenly, without declaration or demand, an army of gray-skinned warriors emerges from the wilderness, moving with purpose and coordination that speaks of careful planning. They attack not as raiders seeking plunder, but as conquerors claiming territory, killing any who resist and enslaving those who surrender. The local Mulhorandi garrison responded as best they could, but they were sized and positioned to handle bandits or small-scale unrest, not a full invasion. The first military units to engage the Gray Orcs were swept aside, overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the invaders' ferocity. Messengers raced south toward the Mulhorandi heartland, carrying desperate warnings that a massive army had appeared on the plateau. The initial reports were met with skepticism, dismissed as exaggeration born of panic. But as more messengers arrived, as the flow of refugees from the plateau swelled to a flood, the terrible truth could no longer be denied. The Orcgate Wars had begun. Over the next 7 years, from -1076 to -1069 Dale Reckoning, this conflict would rage across the territories of Mulhorand, Unther, and the contested plateau. It would claim lives beyond counting, see cities destroyed, and populations enslaved or killed. It would witness the first known deicide in Faerûn's history, the death of a deity at the hands of another god, and it would ultimately require divine intervention on a scale rarely seen before or since to finally repel the invasion and close the portal that had enabled it. The world that existed before -1076 Dale Reckoning, with its stable empires and confident god kings, was about to be shattered. What emerged from the crucible of the Orcgate Wars would be fundamentally different, shaped by trauma and loss, hardened by the knowledge that even divine protection had proven insufficient against this threat. The portal had opened. The Gray Orcs were coming, and nothing would ever be the same. Section 2. The Flood of War. The Gray Orc armies swept across the plateau of Thayd with a speed that caught Mulhorand completely unprepared. You need to understand the scale of what was happening, the sheer impossibility of what the defenders faced. This was not a large warband, or even multiple tribes uniting for a single campaign. This was a full-scale invasion by what appeared to be an entire civilization mobilized for war. Tens of thousands of Gray Orc warriors poured through that hidden portal in continuous waves. And behind the warriors came support elements, supply trains, shamans, and leaders. Even what appeared to be non-combatants establishing settlements in conquered territory. The Gray Orcs proved to be fundamentally different from the orc populations already present in Faerûn. Mountain orcs and common orcs were tribal, fractious, prone to infighting and disorganization. The Gray Orcs displayed a level of coordination and strategic thinking that shocked the Mulhorandi commanders who first faced them. They moved in organized military formations, maintained supply lines, established fortified camps, and adapted their tactics based on the terrain and opposition they encountered. This could imply that their home realm, whatever its nature, had fostered a more developed martial culture, perhaps shaped by generations of warfare against other organized foes. Mulhorand's initial response was hampered by the very nature of its power structure. The empire had grown complacent during its long periods of stability, confident that divine protection and ancient strength would overcome any threat. The military forces stationed on the plateau were sufficient for maintaining order among a restive population, but woefully inadequate for defending against a massive invasion. By the time sufficient reinforcements could be assembled and marched north from the heartland, the Gray Orcs had already seized control of much of the plateau's territory. The Mulhorandi God Kings faced a threat unlike anything in their long existence. These were beings of immense power, divine manifestations, who had led their people for over 1,000 years, who had toppled the ancient empire of Amaskar through divine magic, who considered themselves effectively invincible within their own territories. Yet the Gray Orc invasion was not merely a mortal conflict, but a religious war as well. The orcs brought with them the worship of Gruumsh One-Eye, the savage orc deity whose hatred for other races was fundamental to his nature, and Gruumsh himself took direct interest in this invasion, manifesting his power to support his worshippers in their conquest. The nature of divine conflict in this era was different from what would come later. The gods walked more openly among mortals, their power more directly accessible, the line between divine and mortal realms less firmly drawn. When Mulhorand's deity Orcgate, called Ray by most, led forces against the orc invasion, he was not acting through intermediaries or granting power to priests from a distance. He was physically present, a god in manifest form, commanding armies and wielding divine magic directly against the invaders. Based on the accounts that survive, this represented both the strength of Mulhorand's position and its desperation. If the God Kings themselves had to take the field, the situation must have been dire indeed. The fighting during the first years of the war was characterized by a brutal back-and-forth struggle for control of key territories. The Gray Orcs would seize a region, establish control, and push forward toward the next objective. Mulhorandi forces would counterattack, sometimes successfully retaking lost ground, other times being thrown back with heavy casualties. Neither side could achieve a decisive advantage. The orcs had numbers and the constant flow of reinforcements through the portal. But the Mulhorandi had the resources of an ancient empire, powerful magic, and divine support. The result was a grinding war of attrition that consumed lives and resources at a horrific rate. Unther faced its own challenges during this period. As the war on the plateau intensified, Gray Orc forces began expanding beyond Mulhorandi territory, pushing west toward Unther's borders. The god King Gilgim, who ruled Unther with iron authority, recognized the threat and mobilized his own forces. This created an unusual situation where Mulhorand and Unther, longtime rivals who had fought each other as recently as 3 centuries prior, now found themselves fighting a common enemy. Yet cooperation between the two empires was minimal, hampered by centuries of mutual distrust and competition. Each empire fought its own campaigns, defended its own territories, and shared little intelligence or coordination. The human cost of the war is difficult to calculate with precision, but contemporary accounts suggest it was staggering. Entire communities on the plateau were destroyed or enslaved. The Gray Orcs showed little mercy to those who resisted, and their treatment of prisoners ranged from enslavement to outright execution. Refugees fled the war zone in vast numbers, overwhelming the capacity of Mulhorandi cities to shelter and feed them. Disease spread through overcrowded refugee camps. Famine threatened as agricultural production in the war zone collapsed and trade routes were severed. The empires that had seemed so stable, so permanent, suddenly faced the real possibility of collapse. The military struggle was complicated by the presence of powerful magic on both sides. Mulhorandi battle mages, trained in traditions stretching back to Amaskar's fall, wielded devastating spells that could annihilate entire orc formations. But the Gray Orcs had their own magical traditions, shamans who channeled Gruumsh's power and could call upon elemental forces or enhance their warriors with supernatural strength. The magical exchanges during major battles could reshape the terrain itself, leaving craters and scorched earth that would remain visible for centuries. Based on descriptions of the battlefield aftermath, we can infer that the magical intensity of this conflict exceeded most previous wars in the region's history. The turning point in the war, or perhaps more accurately, the moment that transformed it from a potentially winnable conflict into an existential crisis, came when Gruumsh himself manifested directly on the battlefield. The exact date is not firmly established in surviving records, though it appears to have occurred sometime around -1072 or -1071 Dale reckoning. Several years into the war, the Orc deity's manifestation was not subtle or limited. This was a god at the height of his power, in a realm where divine manifestation was still relatively unrestricted by the limitations that would come later. Gruumsh sought out Ray, the Mulhorandi sun deity who had been personally leading forces against the Orc invasion. What followed was divine combat on a scale rarely witnessed in mortal realms. Two gods locked in direct conflict, while their respective followers fought and died below. The accounts of this battle vary in details, which should not surprise us given that mortal witnesses were attempting to describe events that transcended normal reality. What we know with certainty is the outcome. Ray was slain, a god died, his divine essence scattered or absorbed. His manifestation in the mortal world ended permanently. The death of Ray sent shockwaves through Mulhorand that went far beyond the merely military. This was not supposed to be possible. The God Kings were eternal, had led their people since the Empire's founding, were supposed to be beyond the reach of death. That Gruumsh could kill Ray demonstrated that the divine protection Mulhorand relied upon was not absolute, that even the gods themselves could fall before sufficient power. The psychological impact on Mulhorandi morale cannot be overstated. If their gods could die, what hope did mere mortals have? Yet Ray's death also galvanized Mulhorand in ways that earlier defeats had not. Grief and rage replaced complacency and shock. The full resources of the Empire, previously held back by bureaucratic inertia and political considerations, were now thrown into the war effort. More God Kings took direct roles in the fighting, though they were now more cautious about exposing themselves to direct divine combat with Gruumsh. Horus Ray, who would eventually assume many of Ray's former roles, emerged as a major force in organizing the defense. The nature of Horus Ray's rise suggests that the Mulhorandi pantheon had mechanisms for adapting to even the loss of a major deity, though the trauma of that loss would never fully heal. The war expanded beyond the plateau as the Gray Orcs pushed deeper into Mulhorandi territory and further west into Unther. Battles were fought from the Alamber Sea coast to the western reaches of Unther, across hundreds of miles of territory. Each empire struggled to defend its heartland, while also attempting to push back the invaders. The fighting took on a desperate character, as both sides recognized this was a war of extermination, that no negotiated peace was possible with an enemy that showed no interest in anything less than total conquest. From what fragmentary records survive, we can piece together that certain battles were particularly significant, though the details are often frustratingly sparse. There are references to a great siege, perhaps of a major Mulhorandi city, where both sides committed enormous forces and the fighting lasted for months. There are mentions of battles fought in the narrow passes of the plateau, where terrain favored the defenders and allowed smaller Mulhorandi forces to hold against superior numbers. There are accounts of naval engagements on the Alamber Sea, suggesting the Gray Orcs adapted quickly to include waterborne operations in their strategy. The civilian population suffered immensely throughout these years. Those who could not flee the war zones found themselves caught between armies, subject to occupation by whichever side currently controlled their region. The Gray Orcs established what might be called colonies in conquered territories, bringing through the portal not just warriors, but also civilians who began settling and farming the land. This implies the invasion was intended as permanent conquest and colonization, rather than mere raiding or temporary occupation. The orcs were not planning to leave. They were planning to stay, to replace Mulhorand and Unther with their own civilization built on the ruins of the empires they destroyed. Magic users on both sides pushed the boundaries of their arts during the conflict, developing new spells and techniques driven by desperate necessity. The Mulhorandi wizards, though generally subordinate to the priest class in their empire's hierarchy, gained new prominence as their skills proved crucial to the war effort. Some historians of magic suggest that certain spell developments during the Orcgate Wars influenced magical practice across Faerun for centuries afterward. Though tracing specific innovations to this period is difficult given the limited documentation that survived. By -1070 Dale reckoning, the war had raged for 6 years with no clear end in sight. Both empires were exhausted, their treasuries depleted, their populations decimated by casualties and disease. The Gray Orcs continued to receive reinforcements through the portal, though we might infer from later events that even they were feeling the strain of maintaining such a massive military commitment. The war had reached a terrible equilibrium where neither side could achieve victory, but neither could afford to seek peace. Something had to break this stalemate. That something would be the portal itself. The realization that the only way to end the war was to close the gateway through which the Gray Orcs continued to arrive came gradually to Mulhorand's leadership. As long as the portal remained open, the war was unwinnable. The Orcs' homeland, wherever it lay, could continue sending warriors faster than Mulhorand, and Unther could kill them. But closing the portal presented enormous challenges. First, it had to be found. Thayd had hidden it well, and years of war had not revealed its location. Second, even once found, it would be heavily defended by Orc forces who understood its strategic importance. Third, the magic required to close such a powerful gateway would be immense. requiring the kind of working that only the most powerful mages or divine intervention could accomplish. The search for the portal became a priority for Mulhorand's remaining god kings and most powerful wizards. Divination, magic, scouting expeditions, interrogation of captured orcs, examination of the patterns of orc troop movements, all were employed in an effort to locate the source of the invasion. The breakthrough came in -1069 Dale Reckoning, 7 years into the war, when the portal's location was finally determined. It lay in a remote region of the plateau, concealed by both natural terrain and magical wards that had prevented its earlier discovery. Now came the desperate final phase of the war, the campaign to reach that portal and close it permanently. Section 3. The closing of the gate. The discovery of the portal's location in -1069 Dale Reckoning marked the beginning of the war's final phase. You must understand that simply knowing where the gateway stood did not make reaching it or closing it any less daunting. The Gray Orcs recognized the portal as the lifeline of their entire invasion, the single point without which their conquest would collapse. They had fortified the surrounding area extensively, concentrating substantial military forces specifically to protect this strategic asset. Any force attempting to reach the portal would face not a single battle, but a sustained campaign against an enemy fighting to protect their only link to home. Mulhorand's remaining god kings and military leadership faced difficult strategic decisions. They could assemble a massive army and attempt to fight through to the portal by sheer force of numbers. But this would be costly in lives and resources, and there was no guarantee of success. The Gray Orcs had demonstrated their ability to match Mulhorandi forces in open battle, and on ground of their choosing, defending a position they considered vital, they would fight with desperate ferocity. Alternatively, they could attempt a smaller, more covert operation, but penetrating deep into orc-controlled territory with a small force presented its own enormous risks. The approach ultimately taken appears to have combined elements of both strategies, based on what limited accounts survive from this period. Mulhorand launched a series of large-scale offensives across multiple fronts, drawing Gray Orc forces away from the portal's immediate vicinity, forcing them to commit reserves to other threatened sectors. This could suggest that Mulhorandi military planners understood the value of operational deception. Creating threats the enemy had to respond to in order to weaken the defenses around their true objective. These diversionary attacks were not feints or mere demonstrations. They were full-scale assaults that had to be convincing enough to make the orcs commit significant forces, which meant Mulhorandi soldiers fought and died in battles that were secondary to the main goal. Unther's role during this final phase remains somewhat unclear in the historical record. The relationship between the two empires throughout the war had been characterized more by parallel campaigns than true cooperation. From the limited evidence available, we can infer that Unther launched its own offensives during this period, applying additional pressure on the Gray Orc forces. Though whether this was coordinated with Mulhorand's plans, or simply independent action driven by their own strategic goals, is difficult to determine. Gilgeam, Unther's god king, had his own reasons for wanting the portal closed and the invasion ended, reasons that did not require cooperation with his longtime rivals in Mulhorand. The magical preparations for closing the portal were as important as the military operations. A gateway of this magnitude, stable enough to permit the passage of entire armies over a period of years, could not be unmade through simple counterspells or brute force destruction. The magic required would have to be extraordinary, drawing on power sources beyond what mortal wizards alone could provide. This brings us to the role of divine intervention in the portal's closing, an aspect of the war's conclusion that is well attested in multiple sources, but whose exact nature remains somewhat mysterious. The Mulhorandi pantheon, already directly involved in the war through the manifestations of their god kings, prepared to intervene even more dramatically in the conflict's final act. The death of Ray had demonstrated both the dangers of direct divine combat and the necessity of divine power to counter threats on this scale. The surviving god kings understood that closing the portal would require divine magic, power that only they could wield or channel. But the lessons of Ray's death had not been forgotten. Direct confrontation with Gruumsh had proven fatal. A different approach was needed, one that focused on the portal itself rather than on battling the Orc deity directly. The exact date of the final assault on the portal is recorded as -1069 Dale reckoning, though whether this represents a single day's action or the culmination of a longer campaign is debated among historians. What we know is that Mulhorandi forces, supported by divine power and the Empire's most skilled mages, fought their way to the portal's location. The battle that ensued was among the most intense of the entire war, a desperate struggle where the Gray Orcs threw everything they had into defending their gateway home, while Mulhorand committed whatever resources were necessary to reach and close it. Contemporary accounts speak of the sky itself changing color during the battle, of magical energies so intense they could be felt miles away, of the ground shaking as divine and mortal powers clashed. These descriptions, while clearly influenced by the drama of the moment and possibly exaggerated in the retelling, suggest an engagement that pushed the boundaries of what magical combat normally entailed. The concentration of so much power in one place, divine manifestations and archmage-level spells, combining with the portal's own energies, created conditions that transcended ordinary warfare. The portal's closure was not a simple act, but appears to have been a complex ritual that required time to complete, even as fighting raged around it. The Mulhorandi mages conducting the ritual had to maintain their concentration and precision while protected by warriors holding back waves of desperate orc attacks. One account, preserved in temple records, describes divine fire descending from the heavens to scour the area around the portal, clearing away orc defenders and creating a protective barrier within which the ritual could proceed. This could imply direct intervention by Horus Ray or another of the Mulhorandi deities, wielding power to protect the mortal mages who were performing the actual work of closing the gateway. The magic used to close the portal likely involved severing its connection to whatever realm lay on the other side, collapsing the stable passage that Thayd had created years earlier. The theoretical principles of such a working are complex even by the standards of archmage-level magic, requiring not just raw power, but intricate understanding of planar mechanics and the nature of reality itself. That Mulhorand's mages succeeded suggests they had access to substantial knowledge about portal magic, perhaps including information recovered from Thayd's own research or derived from ancient Imiskari lore that predated the current empires. When the portal finally collapsed, the effect was reportedly visible across a wide area. Witnesses miles away described a flash of light, a sound like thunder, and a sensation of something fundamental changing in the world around them. At the portal's location, the gateway simply ceased to exist. The stable passage between worlds severed permanently. The Gray Orc warriors on the Faerun side of the portal were cut off from their homeland instantly and completely. No more reinforcements would arrive. No retreat was possible. They were stranded in a world not their own, surrounded by enemies, with their entire strategic position suddenly transformed from invaders receiving endless support to isolated forces facing inevitable defeat. The immediate aftermath of the portal's closing saw the Gray Orc forces' cohesion begin to disintegrate. Cut off from home and leadership, different war bands and commanders made different choices about how to respond to their new situation. Some continued fighting with the same ferocity they had shown throughout the war, perhaps hoping the portal could somehow be reopened, or simply determined to take as many enemies with them as they could. Others attempted to retreat, pulling back toward defensible positions in the hope of holding out until some solution to their predicament could be found. A few, recognizing the hopelessness of their position, actually attempted to negotiate surrender or safe passage, though the Mulhorandi and Unthuri, after 7 years of brutal war, were not generally inclined toward mercy. The final phase of the war, the campaign to eliminate or subjugate the remaining Gray Orc forces, lasted for several more years, though the outcome was never in doubt. Once the portal closed, Mulhorand and Unther could now focus their full resources on destroying an enemy that could no longer be reinforced or resupplied. The Gray Orcs fought with the desperation of warriors who knew they were doomed. But desperation alone could not overcome the mathematics of attrition. Slowly, steadily, their numbers dwindled through casualties, starvation, disease, and eventually, for some, acceptance of enslavement as an alternative to death. Not all the Gray Orcs were killed or enslaved, however. Some bands managed to retreat to remote areas where they established hidden communities, surviving through a combination of raiding, scavenging, and eventually limited agriculture. Others, particularly those who had brought families through the portal during the invasion's early years when it seemed conquest was succeeding, scattered into the wilderness and simply tried to survive far from the reach of the empires they had fought. These scattered survivors would form the basis of the Gray Orc population that would persist in the region for centuries, eventually becoming most concentrated in Thayd when that nation achieved independence from Mulhorand. The human cost of fully pacifying the region after the portal's closing is difficult to calculate, though it clearly added substantially to the war's already staggering death toll. The Gray Orcs who remained after being cut off from their homeland numbered in the tens of thousands, possibly higher, and reducing or incorporating this population took years of continued military operations. The campaigns during this period had a different character than the main war, being more about hunting down scattered enemy forces than fighting large-scale battles. But they were deadly nonetheless for those involved. For Mulhorand, the war's conclusion brought both relief and a profound sense of loss. The immediate threat was ended, but the cost had been enormous. Ray was dead, the first confirmed death of a Mulhorandi deity, a trauma that shook the empire's religious foundations. Hundreds of thousands of lives had been lost, both military personnel and civilians caught in the fighting or victims of disease and famine. The economy was shattered, the treasury depleted, and large regions of territory were devastated wastelands that would take generations to recover. The plateau that would become Thayd had been particularly hard hit, its population reduced, its infrastructure destroyed, its landscape scarred by years of intensive warfare. Unther faced similar challenges, though the war had affected its territory somewhat less than Mulhorand's. Giljeem emerged from the conflict with his authority intact, even enhanced by his role in defeating the invasion. But Unther too had paid heavily in blood and treasure, and the long-term economic and demographic effects would shape the empire's trajectory for centuries to come. The relationship between Unther and Mulhorand after the war remained complex, neither true alliance nor open hostility, but a wary coexistence between powers that had fought a common enemy without truly cooperating. The question of what to do with the site of the former portal occupied considerable debate among Mulhorand's leadership. Some argued for sealing the area entirely, preventing anyone from approaching the place where such a terrible gateway had existed. Others wanted to establish a permanent military presence to guard against any possibility of the portal being reopened. Eventually, a compromise appears to have been reached, with the site being carefully monitored but not completely sealed off, though access was strictly controlled, and any magical activity in the vicinity was closely scrutinized. Divine politics within the Mulhorandi pantheon underwent significant changes in the war's aftermath. Horus Ray's prominence increased as he assumed many of Ray's former roles and responsibilities, though he never fully replaced the fallen sun god in the hearts of Mulhorand's people. The fact that a deity could die, that divine protection was not absolute, introduced a note of uncertainty into Mulhorandi religion that had not existed before. The people still worshipped their god kings, still looked to them for leadership and protection. But the unquestioning faith of earlier eras had been shaken by Ray's death and could never be fully restored. The strategic lessons of the Orcgate Wars influenced military thinking across Faerûn as knowledge of the conflict spread to other regions. The importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, the dangers of portals and planar magic, the necessity of coordinated responses to large-scale threats. These and other insights drawn from the war shaped how kingdoms and empires prepared for future conflicts. The war also demonstrated the potential for divine intervention in mortal affairs, though whether this made rulers more or less confident in their security is difficult to say. Magic users throughout Faerûn took particular interest in the technical aspects of the portal's creation and closure. While the specific rituals Thayd had used remained unknown, the basic principle that stable interplanar or interregional portals were possible had been dramatically proven. This knowledge was both empowering and terrifying. If such gateways could be opened, they could potentially provide access to resources, knowledge, or allies from other realms. But they could also unleash threats comparable to, or worse, than the Gray Orc invasion. The magical community's attitude toward planar research became more cautious, more aware of the potential consequences of opening doors that might be difficult or impossible to close. For the Gray Orcs who remained in Faerûn after the portal's closing, their future was uncertain and difficult. Cut off permanently from their homeland, they had to adapt to survival in a world that saw them as enemies and invaders, some integrated over time into the broader orc populations of the region. Their distinct gray-skinned appearance gradually becoming just another variation within the diverse orc peoples. Others maintained their separate identity, preserving what they could of their original culture while adapting to their new circumstances. By the time Thayd achieved independence from Mulhorand centuries later, the descendants of the Gray Orc invaders had become simply one more element in that nation's complex multiracial society. The Orcgate Wars thus concluded not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual winding down of hostilities, as the isolated Gray Orc forces were eliminated or absorbed. The closing of the portal in negative 1069 Dale Reckoning marked the turning point, the moment when the war's outcome became inevitable. But the actual pacification of the region took years more. When finally complete, Mulhorand and Unther could begin the long process of recovery and rebuilding, forever changed by the conflict they had survived. Section 4: Wounds and Recovery. The years immediately following the portal's closing in -1069 Dale Reckoning were characterized by a grinding campaign to eliminate or subjugate the remaining Gray Orc forces scattered across Mulhorand and Unther. You must understand that even with their lifelines severed, tens of thousands of Gray Orc warriors remained on Faerûn's soil, and they did not simply surrender or vanish. These were seasoned fighters who had crossed through a portal between worlds, expecting conquest and glory, who had fought for 7 years against 2 empires, and who now found themselves stranded with no way home. Their responses to this predicament varied widely, creating a complex mosaic of conflicts that would take years to fully resolve. Some Gray Orc war leaders, recognizing the mathematical impossibility of their situation, attempted to negotiate terms of surrender or safe passage to neutral territories. These negotiations were complicated by cultural differences, by language barriers, and most significantly, by the depth of hatred that 7 years of brutal warfare had created on both sides. Mulhorand and Unther had suffered catastrophic losses, seen cities destroyed and populations massacred, and witnessed the death of a god. The appetite for mercy or accommodation was limited at best. Most attempts at negotiation ended in betrayal or breakdown, with the Gray Orcs either attacking when they felt the terms were unacceptable, or the human forces simply using negotiations as a means to locate and surround Orc concentrations before launching attacks. Other Gray Orc bands rejected any possibility of surrender and fought on with desperate ferocity. These groups established fortified positions in defensible terrain, often in mountainous regions or dense forests, where larger Mulhorandi or Unthuric forces would have difficulty operating effectively. They raided surrounding areas for supplies, ambushed military patrols, and generally made themselves as costly as possible for the empires to eliminate. The campaigns against these holdouts resembled later guerrilla warfare more than conventional military operations, requiring sustained effort over months or years to locate and destroy each remaining band. The costs in casualties continued to mount even though the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. A third category of Gray Orcs, perhaps the most pragmatic or simply the most desperate, sought to disappear entirely from imperial attention. These groups, often including substantial numbers of non-combatants who had come through the portal during the invasion's early years when conquest seemed assured, retreated to the most remote regions they could find. They established hidden settlements in areas too poor or difficult for the empires to consider worth occupying, places where survival would be challenging. but where they might escape the ongoing purges. Some of these communities succeeded in remaining hidden for decades, only gradually coming to the attention of imperial authorities as populations grew. And the need for resources forced increasing contact with surrounding regions. The treatment of captured Gray Orcs varied depending on circumstances, regional practices, and the temperament of individual commanders. Mulhorand, with its long tradition of slavery, generally enslaved captured orcs who were deemed potentially useful. Adult males considered too dangerous for slavery were typically executed, while females and juveniles were more likely to be spared and incorporated into the slave population. The Gray Orcs' physical strength and endurance made them valuable as laborers, particularly for heavy construction work or agricultural tasks in difficult conditions. Over time, enslaved Gray Orcs became a recognized component of Mulhorand's diverse slave population, alongside enslaved humans from various backgrounds and occasional members of other non-human races. Unther's approach appears to have been somewhat harsher overall, with Gruumsh showing little inclination toward mercy for those who had invaded his realm. Mass executions of captured Gray Orc warriors were common in Unther, though practical considerations eventually led to some enslavement as the labor needs of reconstruction overwhelmed ideological preference for simple elimination. The difference in approach between the two empires, while perhaps not as stark as some accounts suggest, reflected their different political cultures and their God Kings' personalities. Mulhorand's divine rulers were stern, but could be pragmatic, while Gruumsh ruled Unther with a harshness that would only intensify in the centuries ahead. The process of pacifying the region and dealing with the remaining Gray Orc population took approximately 5 years of sustained effort, from -1069 to -1064 Dale reckoning. By the latter date, organized Gray Orc resistance had been largely eliminated, though scattered bands would continue to appear occasionally for decades afterward. The total number of Gray Orcs killed during this pacification phase is impossible to calculate with accuracy, but it likely numbered in the tens of thousands. The number enslaved was substantial enough that Gray Orc slaves became a common sight in Mulhorand's cities and agricultural estates within a generation of the war's end. Mulhorand's recovery efforts focused heavily on the plateau of Thayd, which had suffered the worst devastation during the invasion. Entire towns and villages had to be rebuilt from ruins. Agricultural land had to be cleared of debris and bodies, then restored to productive use. Irrigation systems destroyed during the fighting needed reconstruction. The Empire organized resettlement programs, offering incentives to encourage Mulhorandi citizens from less affected regions to move to the plateau and help rebuild. Some of these settlers came willingly, attracted by promises of land and opportunity. Others were essentially compelled, with certain criminal sentences being commuted in exchange for accepting resettlement obligations. The resettlement programs brought together diverse populations on the plateau, creating a more heterogeneous society than had existed before the wars. Native survivors of the region mixed with newcomers from other parts of Mulhorand, with enslaved Gray Orcs and other laborers, with merchants and craftsmen seeking opportunities in a rebuilding economy. This mixing of populations had long-term cultural effects, helping to create a distinct regional identity that was Mulhorandi in overall framework, but different in character from the Empire's heartland, based on Thayd's eventual development as an independent nation. We can infer that these post-war demographic changes contributed to creating conditions where separatist sentiment could eventually flourish. The economic recovery was slow and uneven. Mulhorand's treasury had been emptied by the war, and the costs of reconstruction exceeded what could be readily extracted from a depleted and suffering population. Tax collection in the affected regions was difficult because there was simply little wealth left to tax. The empire borrowed from merchant consortiums and temples, taking on debts that would burden the treasury for decades. Trade patterns had been disrupted and took years to reestablish. Some trading partners who had found alternative arrangements during the war years were reluctant to return to previous relationships, particularly if those alternatives proved more profitable or reliable. Agricultural production recovered faster than other sectors of the economy, driven by immediate necessity and by the fact that farming required relatively less capital investment than other industries. But even agriculture faced challenges. Draft animals had been killed or requisitioned during the war and needed to be replaced. Seed stocks had been depleted. Irrigation infrastructure required repair. The labor force was diminished and traumatized. It took nearly a decade for agricultural output to return to pre-war levels. And during that period, periodic food shortages and localized famines continued to plague the region. Urban reconstruction proceeded even more slowly than agricultural recovery. Cities required enormous investments to rebuild, and the damaged urban centers competed for limited resources. Some towns that had been destroyed during the fighting were never rebuilt, their populations dispersing to other locations rather than attempting to resurrect what had been lost. New settlements emerged in locations chosen for strategic or economic reasons rather than historical continuity. The urban landscape of the region was thus remade by the war and its aftermath, with the geography of civilization literally redrawn on maps that bore little resemblance to what had existed before. The psychological and cultural impacts of the war manifested in complex ways across Mulhorandi society. Veterans of the conflict struggled to readjust to civilian life, carrying physical and mental scars that peaceful society was ill-equipped to understand or address. many found they could not return to their previous occupations or communities, that the experiences of war had changed them too fundamentally. Some became wanderers, unable to settle. Others formed communities of fellow veterans, where shared experience created understanding unavailable elsewhere. A few turned to banditry or mercenary work, finding they could not function outside the violent contexts that war had trained them for. The religious landscape of Mulhorand underwent subtle but significant changes in the war's aftermath. The death of Ray remained a central trauma that theology struggled to fully explain or reconcile with traditional teachings about divine immortality. Horus Ray's assumption of many of Ray's former roles and responsibilities helped maintain continuity in religious practice, but the transition was not seamless. Some worshippers felt that Horus Ray was an inadequate replacement, that something essential had been lost that could never be recovered. Others embraced Horus Ray enthusiastically, seeing in him a deity who had proven himself through the crisis. These divisions created tensions within the religious establishment that persisted for generations. The priest class faced questions about their authority and their ability to speak for the divine. If the gods could die, if divine protection had proven insufficient to prevent catastrophe, what did that mean for the priest-king's system of governance? Mulhorand's religious authorities responded by emphasizing the ultimate victory, the fact that the empire had survived, and the portal had been closed through divine intervention. They reframed Ray's death not as a failure, but as a sacrifice, a god giving his existence to save his people. This theological reinterpretation helped maintain religious cohesion, though it never completely silenced doubts and questions. New religious practices emerged in response to the war's trauma. Cults focused on protection and defense gained prominence, with deities associated with warfare and guardianship receiving increased devotion. Rituals designed to ward against planar incursions or detect portal magic became standard in many temples. The anniversary of key battles, and particularly of the portal's closing, became occasions for religious observance, with special ceremonies and offerings. These new practices gradually became integrated into Mulhorand's religious calendar, institutionalizing the memory of the war within the very structure of worship. The military establishment underwent the most obvious and dramatic changes. The armies that had fought the Orcgate Wars were substantially reorganized in the aftermath, incorporating lessons learned through bitter experience. Standing forces were increased and professionalized, reducing reliance on militia and conscription. Training was standardized and intensified, with particular emphasis on combined arms tactics and coordination between different unit types. The role of magic users within military structures was formalized, creating permanent positions for battle mages, rather than hiring them ad hoc for specific campaigns. Fortification design evolved to address vulnerabilities the war had exposed. New defensive works incorporated features specifically intended to counter orc tactics and to provide better protection against magical assault. Strategic strongpoints were established throughout the empire, particularly in border regions and along likely invasion routes. These fortifications served both defensive purposes and as permanent bases for military forces that could respond rapidly to emerging threats. The construction and maintenance of this network of fortifications represented a substantial ongoing expense, but one that Mulhorand's leadership considered essential given their recent experience. Intelligence gathering and strategic reconnaissance received unprecedented investment and attention. The surprise nature of the Gray Orc invasion, the initial uncertainty about the scale and source of the threat, and the years spent trying to locate the portal had all demonstrated the critical importance of information. Mulhorand established more systematic networks of scouts, spies, and informants operating both within the empire and in neighboring regions. Divination magic was employed more extensively for strategic purposes, with specialized priests and mages focusing specifically on detecting threats and gathering intelligence through magical means. The magical community's response to the war shaped arcane research and education for generations. The crucial role of battle magic in the conflict elevated the status of combat-focused mages, who had previously been somewhat looked down upon by scholars pursuing more theoretical or esoteric studies. Schools specializing in war magic grew in prominence and enrollment. New spells developed during the war were refined and disseminated more widely. The study of countermagic and dispelling techniques received increased attention, as did research into wards and protective enchantments that could defend against the kind of magical assault the Gray Orc shamans had employed. Planar magic, particularly the creation and manipulation of portals, became a subject of intense debate within magical circles. The portal that had enabled the invasion had been created by Thayd, a wizard of exceptional skill, working with knowledge that might have derived from ancient Imaskar. This demonstrated that such magic was possible for mortal casters, at least under certain conditions. Some mages argued that understanding portal magic was essential precisely because it was possible, that ignorance was more dangerous than knowledge. Others contended that the Orcgate Wars had proven such research was too dangerous to pursue, that the potential for catastrophe outweighed any possible benefits. Mulhorand's government took an official position restricting planar research, though enforcement of these restrictions varied over time and by region. Licenses and oversight were required for certain categories of magical research. Unauthorized attempts to create portals or conduct planar summonings were criminalized with severe penalties. These regulations probably reduced, but did not eliminate such research, as ambitious or reckless mages continued to pursue forbidden knowledge despite the risks. The tension between official restriction and magical curiosity would characterize planar studies in the region for centuries. The Gray Orcs who survived the war's aftermath, whether as slaves, as members of isolated free communities, or eventually as integrated residents of the region, maintained elements of their original culture, even as they adapted to circumstances. The worship of Gruumsh continued among the Gray Orc population, though it necessarily became more private and less openly practiced, particularly among the enslaved. Religious practices adapted to the reality that Gruumsh's favor had not prevented their defeat and stranding in an alien world. Some Gray Orc religious thinkers interpreted this as a test or trial, others as punishment for failures during the invasion, still others as simply the inscrutable will of a deity whose purposes transcended mortal understanding. Cultural practices beyond religion also persisted and evolved. The Gray Orcs maintained their own language, though over generations it absorbed elements from the languages of surrounding populations and eventually developed into a distinct dialect, crafting traditions, particularly in areas like metalworking and leather preparation, showed Gray Orc influence that would become incorporated into the broader material culture of the region. Musical traditions and oral storytelling kept alive memories of the invasion and of the homeland that had been lost, though these memories became increasingly mythologized as generations passed and direct witnesses died. The integration of the Gray Orc population into the broader society of the region occurred gradually and unevenly over centuries. Enslaved Gray Orcs who earned or purchased freedom sometimes remained in areas where they had been held, forming small communities near Mulhorandi settlements. Children of mixed human and Gray Orc ancestry began appearing within a generation of the war's end, creating populations that straddled racial and cultural boundaries. By the time Thayd achieved independence several centuries after the Orcgate Wars, the region's Gray Orc population had grown substantially through natural increase and was much more integrated into local society, though still facing discrimination and disadvantage in many contexts. The relationship between former enemies evolved in complex ways across generations. Mulhorandi civilians who had survived the invasion often maintained bitter hatred toward orcs of any variety, making no distinction between the Gray Orcs who had invaded and mountain orcs, or other orc populations who had played no role in the war. This prejudice created ongoing tensions and occasional violence. But younger generations born after the war's end had no direct memories of the conflict and sometimes developed more nuanced views. Economic relationships gradually developed as Gray Orc craftsmen and laborers interacted with human employers and customers. These daily interactions over decades and centuries slowly transformed the relationship from one of pure enmity to something more complicated. Section 5. The Long Shad. The centuries that followed the Orcgate Wars saw the conflict's consequences continue to shape Eastern Faerûn in ways both obvious and subtle. You need to understand that historical events of such magnitude do not simply conclude and then fade away. They become embedded in the cultural memory of peoples. They alter trajectories of civilizations. They create conditions that influence developments generations, or even centuries later. The Orcgate Wars cast a long shadow over Mulhorand, Unther, and the region that would become Thayd. A shadow that would darken the path these nations followed through all the ages that came after. Mulhorand, in the centuries following the war, never fully recovered the confident supremacy it had enjoyed before the invasion. The empire survived, certainly, and remained a significant power in Eastern Faerûn for over 1,000 years after the portal's closing. But it was a diminished power, burdened by debts and demographic weaknesses, never quite able to project the authority it once had. The God Kings continued to rule. The temples maintained their influence. The armies marched when needed. Yet there was always an underlying awareness that what had been nearly lost once might be lost again. That even divine protection had proven insufficient when tested by the Gray Orc invasion. The evolution of Horusray's position within the Mulhorandi pantheon reflected the Empire's attempt to move forward while carrying the weight of Ray's death. Horusray gradually assumed not just Ray's administrative and religious roles, but also much of his symbolic significance, becoming the preeminent solar deity of Mulhorand's state religion. Temples to Ray became temples to Horusray, with theological explanations that framed the transition as transformation rather than replacement. This religious adaptation allowed Mulhorand to maintain continuity in its divine rulership system, despite the unprecedented trauma of losing a major deity. Based on how completely Horusray eventually absorbed Ray's former position, we can infer that the Mulhorandi religious establishment succeeded in managing what could have been a crisis of faith that might have destabilized the entire theocratic structure. Unther's trajectory in the post-war centuries diverged significantly from Mulhorand's, though both empires had faced the same external threat. Where Mulhorand adapted and reformed, Unther ossified under Gilgeam's increasingly tyrannical rule. The God King who had led his empire through the Orcgate Wars became progressively more paranoid and authoritarian as centuries passed, seeing threats everywhere and responding with harsh repression. Whether the trauma of the war contributed to this psychological deterioration, or whether it simply revealed tendencies that had always existed in Gilgeam's character, we cannot say with certainty. What is clear is that Unther's political culture became characterized by fear and oppression to a degree that exceeded even Mulhorand's rigid hierarchy. The relationship between Mulhorand and Unther remained tense throughout the centuries, following their shared struggle against the Gray Orcs. The temporary cooperation forced by mutual danger did not translate into lasting alliance once the threat had passed. Border disputes resurfaced, trade conflicts erupted, and diplomatic relations cycled through periods of cool formality and outright hostility. Yet neither empire ever again fought a full-scale war against the other comparable to their conflicts before the Orcgate Wars. This could suggest that the memory of what they had faced together and the recognition of their shared vulnerability created restraints that prevented their rivalry from escalating to total war. They fought through proxies and limited engagements instead, maintaining a tense equilibrium that would persist until external factors finally destroyed it in later ages. The plateau of Thayd developed its own distinct identity during the centuries of recovery and reconstruction following the Orcgate Wars. The mixing of populations that had occurred during resettlement, the presence of a substantial Gray Orc population, both enslaved and free, the physical and psychological distance from Mulhorand's heartland, all contributed to creating a regional culture that was recognizably Mulhorandi in origin, but increasingly different in character. The wizards, who had always been prominent in the region, maintained their traditions and passed them down through generations of apprentices, creating magical lineages that would eventually produce the Red Wizards, who would lead Thayd to independence. Thayd's eventual rebellion against Mulhorand and achievement of independence occurred in -222 Dale reckoning, over 800 years after the Orcgate Wars had concluded. The Red Wizards who led this successful revolt were the heirs to magical traditions that had existed in the region since before Thayd's original rebellion. Traditions that had survived the Orcgate Wars and the centuries of Mulhorandi domination that followed. The specific grievances that drove Thayd's independence movement were products of their own time, relating to religious impositions and restrictions on magical practice. Yet the success of the rebellion and the character of the independent nation that emerged were shaped by the region's history, including the demographic and cultural changes resulting from the Orcgate Wars. Independent Thayd became known for its multiracial character and its dominance by wizards rather than priests, both features that distinguished it sharply from Mulhorand. The Gray Orc population that had resulted from the Orcgate Wars was integrated into Thayan society more completely than would have been conceivable in Mulhorand proper. While not equals with humans in Thayd's hierarchy, Gray Orcs served in the military, worked as free laborers and craftsmen, and occupied various positions within the complex social structure the Red Wizards established. This integration represented the culmination of centuries of gradual adaptation and accommodation, transforming the descendants of invaders into recognized members of regional society. The memory of the Orcgate Wars was preserved differently in different cultural contexts. For Mulhorand, the conflict remained a central event in national history, commemorated in annual religious festivals, depicted in temple art, recounted in schools where history was taught. The narrative that developed emphasized divine sacrifice and ultimate victory, the terrible cost, but also the proof that Mulhorand and its gods could overcome even the most existential threats. This version of the war's history served ideological purposes, reinforcing the legitimacy of the God King's rule and the importance of maintaining proper religious observance and social order. For Unther, the Orcgate Wars became part of the mythology of Gilgeim's greatness, evidence of his power and his essential role in protecting his people. Unthuric accounts of the war tended to emphasize their God King's contributions, while minimizing or ignoring Mulhorand's role, creating a narrative where Unther had borne the primary burden of defeating the invasion. This selective memory served Gilgeim's propaganda purposes, helping to justify his authoritarian rule as necessary for security against threats that only his power could counter. The accuracy of historical memory was subordinated to political utility in Gilgeim's Unther. For the Gray Orc population descended from the invaders, the Orcgate Wars represented a foundational myth, the story of how their ancestors had come to dwell in Faerûn. This oral tradition was necessarily maintained privately during the centuries when Gray Orcs were predominantly enslaved or marginalized, passed down through families and small communities rather than through public institutions. The Gray Orc version of the war emphasized different elements than human accounts, focusing on the courage and skill of their warrior ancestors, on the tragedy of being cut off from their homeland, on the struggles of survival in a hostile world. This narrative served to maintain group identity and pride despite the disadvantaged position most Gray Orcs occupied in Mulhorandi or later Thayd society. The scholarly study of the Orcgate Wars, conducted by historians and sages removed from direct cultural stakes in how the conflict was remembered, attempted to reconstruct accurate accounts from fragmentary and often contradictory sources. These scholars faced substantial challenges, as many records had been lost during the war itself or in the chaotic aftermath, and the accounts that survived were often colored by the biases and perspectives of their authors. The question of where the portal had connected to remained a subject of particular debate, with various theories proposed, but none definitively proven. Some scholars argued for a distant region of Toril itself, others for a pocket dimension or demiplane, still others for a completely separate material plane. The evidence was insufficient to resolve the debate conclusively. The location of the former portal site became associated with various legends and rumors over the centuries. Tales circulated of strange phenomena in the area, of voices heard on the wind, of visions experienced by those who ventured too close. Some accounts describe the region as cursed or haunted, others as a place where the barriers between planes remained thin and unpredictable magical effects might occur. Whether these stories reflected genuine supernatural phenomena or were simply the sort of myths that naturally accumulate around sites associated with historical trauma, we cannot determine from surviving evidence. What is documented is that the area never became heavily populated or developed, suggesting that whether from superstition or practical considerations, people chose to avoid it. The magical study of portal creation and planar mechanics continued despite official restrictions, though often in secretive or unauthorized contexts. Ambitious wizards throughout the centuries following the Orcgate Wars sought to understand the principles behind Thayd's creation of the gateway, hoping to harness similar power for their own purposes. Some research was conducted with approval and oversight, focused on theoretical understanding and defensive applications, like detecting or closing hostile portals. Other research was conducted illicitly by mages who believed the potential benefits of mastering portal magic outweighed the risks, or who simply valued knowledge for its own sake, regardless of consequences. This ongoing research occasionally produced results or incidents that attracted public attention. Reports would surface of a mage attempting to open a portal and either succeeding with unpredictable consequences or failing catastrophically with destructive effects. Authorities would investigate, make arrests if the researcher could be caught, issue new proclamations about the dangers of unsanctioned magical experimentation. Yet the research continued, generation after generation, because the fundamental questions Thayd had answered remained tantalizing to those who followed in the magical traditions he had helped establish. Based on later developments in portal magic visible in other regions of Faerun, we can infer that some of this research did advance understanding. That knowledge accumulated despite restrictions and setbacks. The military doctrines that emerged from the Orcgate Wars influenced how kingdoms across Faerun organized and employed their armed forces for centuries. The importance of combined arms coordination, the value of mobile reserves, the necessity of strong intelligence networks. These and other lessons spread beyond Mulhorand and Unther as military knowledge disseminated through mercenaries, military advisors hired by various kingdoms, and scholarly treatises on warfare. Generals studying the Orcgate Wars centuries later could identify strategic errors made by both sides and incorporate those lessons into their own planning. The conflict became a case study in military academies and a reference point for discussions of how to respond to large-scale invasions. The theological implications of Ray's death continued to be debated by religious scholars and philosophers long after the immediate crisis had passed. The fact that a deity could be killed by another deity raised questions about the nature of divine power and the relationships between different pantheons. If Gruumsh could kill Ray, what prevented other deities from engaging in similar conflicts? What were the rules or constraints governing divine behavior? And what happened when those rules were violated or proved inadequate? These questions did not have simple answers, and different religious traditions developed different theological frameworks for understanding divine mortality and the limits of godly power. The experience of the Orcgate Wars influenced how various cultures and kingdoms approached relationships with non-human races. The Gray Orc invasion had created or reinforced prejudices against orcs in general, with many humans making no distinction between the Gray Orcs who had invaded and other orc populations who had no connection to those events. This prejudice contributed to conflicts and tensions between humans and orcs throughout eastern Faerûn for centuries, creating cycles of violence and retaliation that had roots in the trauma of the war, even when the specific participants had no direct connection to it. Yet the eventual integration of Gray Orcs into Thayan society also demonstrated that even deep enmity could be overcome given enough time and appropriate circumstances. The economic impacts of the war, while severe in the immediate aftermath, eventually faded as normal patterns of production and trade were reestablished. Within a century of the war's end, the economies of Mulhorand and Unther had largely recovered to pre-war levels of output, though the specific structure and trade patterns were different than before. Some industries and trade routes that had been disrupted never recovered, while new ones emerged to fill the gaps. The plateau region, once devastated, eventually became productive again, though it took over a century of sustained effort and investment to fully restore agricultural and urban infrastructure. The demographic impacts took even longer to overcome. The massive population losses from combat, disease, and famine required generations of natural increase to replace. The gender imbalances created by heavy military casualties gradually corrected themselves over time as birth rates stabilized. The mixing of populations that occurred during Reconstruction created new family lines and social networks that would not have existed without the war's disruption of established patterns. By the time Thayd achieved independence 8 centuries after the Orcgate Wars, the population of the plateau had long since exceeded pre-war levels. But the composition and distribution of that population was fundamentally different than it would have been without the invasion. The Orcgate Wars thus stand as a defining event not just for those who lived through them, but for all the generations that followed. The immediate impacts were catastrophic, nearly destroying 2 ancient empires, killing a god, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The longer-term impacts were more subtle, but no less significant, shaping political trajectories, influencing military and magical development, altering demographic and cultural patterns, and creating the conditions that would eventually lead to Thayd's emergence as an independent nation. The portal that Thayd opened as part of his failed rebellion became the gateway for an invasion that transformed Eastern Faerûn in ways that would reverberate for over a millennium. For those seeking to understand the history of the Forgotten Realms, the Orcgate Wars offer crucial insights into how singular events can reshape entire regions, how the actions of individuals can have consequences far beyond what they intended or foresaw, and how societies respond to and recover from existential trauma. The war demonstrated that even the greatest powers are vulnerable when faced with threats they did not anticipate, that divine protection has limits, and that survival often comes at costs that burden generations yet unborn. It showed both the worst of what mortals can inflict upon each other and the capacity for adaptation and resilience that allows civilizations to endure even the most catastrophic setbacks. The portal to hell that opened on the plateau of Thayd in -1076 Dale Reckoning was closed 7 years later through desperate effort and divine sacrifice. But the door had been opened, and the world that emerged on the other side was forever changed. The Gray Orcs who poured through that gateway sought to conquer and replace the civilizations they found. And though they ultimately failed, their invasion left marks on the land and people that never fully faded. The empires that survived were diminished. The god who fell was not restored, and the descendants of the invaders became part of the very society their ancestors had sought to destroy. This is the nature of war on such a scale, that victory and defeat become complicated categories, that endings are never as clean as we might wish, and that the consequences ripple forward through time long after the fighting has ceased. If you have enjoyed this comprehensive exploration of the Orcgate Wars, one of the Forgotten Realms' most significant and devastating conflicts, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are countless more stories waiting to be told from the rich tapestry of Dungeons and Dragons lore, forgotten chapters of history that deserve to be remembered, overlooked events that shaped the worlds we adventure in. Your support allows me to continue researching and presenting these deep dives into the lore that makes our favorite game worlds come alive. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may your dice roll high and your adventures be legendary.